The current tension around the northern Danish autonomy acutely demonstrates the inconsistency of the so-called rule-based world order constructed by the West. Shortcomings of Copenhagen's long-standing policy of unconditional submission to the U.S., its senior ally, are plain to see. The presence of the North Atlantic Bloc is evidently a destabilizing factor in the military-political atmosphere in the region. Planning to follow the path of Arctic militarization, European capitals should understand that their attempts to escalate the situation in high latitudes and create security threats to a full Arctic community member, of course I am talking about Russia, will have the most severe consequences for them. In attempts to implement the criminal plan with the coalition of the so-called willing, the responsibility for the lives of UK subjects will lie entirely with London. Our position remains unchanged. It's well known. All foreign contingents in Ukraine will be regarded as legitimate targets for the armed forces of the Russian Federation. The British component will not be an exception. UK Defence Minister John Healey, during his speech in the country's parliament, publicly acknowledged London's participation in the illegal detention by the United States of the Russian tanker Marinera in the North Atlantic. He presented it in such a way that London, at Washington's request, provided extensive assistance in this operation, transferring aerial reconnaissance data to the U.S. and deploying a Royal Navy supply ship. In the context of this incident, London has begun to examine the issue of using the national sanctions law and the 2018 money laundering law as a legal ground to employ British armed forces to detain ships on the high seas that are seen by London as seemingly bypassing the illegal unilateral restrictions set by the West. We will consider the implementation of such aggressive intentions as a direct violation of the provisions of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which, as we remember, is actively endorsed by the British themselves. On January 11th, the same John Healey, in the context of countering alleged Russian aggression, announced the development by the British for the needs of the Ukrainian armed forces of new high-precision Nightfall ballistic missiles with a range of over 500 kilometers, resistant to electronic warfare. In this regard, we would like to note that the possible use by the Kyiv regime of such and any other missile weapons deep into Russian territory only brings closer the moment when London will be declared a direct party to the conflict, with all the resulting retaliatory measures. Our country, as the largest Arctic power, closely watches the situation around Greenland. We proceed from the fact that any disagreements around this autonomous, self-governing territory should be resolved through negotiations, in accordance with international law, taking into account the interests of the people of this self-governing region. The current tension around the northern Danish autonomy acutely demonstrates the inconsistency of the so-called rule-based world order constructed by the West. Shortcomings of Copenhagen's long-standing policy of unconditional submission to the U.S., its senior ally, are plain to see. We stand in solidarity with China's position on the unacceptability of references to any activities of Russia and China around Greenland as reasons for the current exacerbation. Before blaming others for disagreements among themselves, NATO members and Euro bureaucrats should first more clearly realize their own responsibility for the deep and rapid erosion of the international legal foundations of global security architecture. The presence of the North Atlantic Bloc is evidently a destabilizing factor in the military-political atmosphere in the region. Planning to follow the path of Arctic militarization, European capitals should understand that their attempts to escalate the situation in high latitudes and create security threats to a full Arctic community member, of course I am talking about Russia, will have the most severe consequences for them.
Trump, under the pretext of ensuring security from China and Russia, announced intentions to establish control over Greenland, considering it a strategic resource of the United States. How does Russia's foreign ministry assess Washington's claims to this territory?
Neither Russia nor China has announced any such plans. There is no factual information that could confirm them in any way. That's the first point. Meanwhile, both Russia and, by the way, recently China, say they want to develop relations with this region of the world. For our country, this is natural. Interaction and cooperation are given to us by nature. We are part of the Arctic region ourselves. Donald Trump also recently stated that any countries trading with Iran would face 25% tariffs. The U.S. is also considering strong options against Iran, including military measures. The question is how Russia views the U.S. use of military threats, unilateral sanctions against sovereign countries. Russia does not recognize the unilateral, illegitimate sanctions against sovereign countries, as it considers them a gross violation of international law. We have repeatedly mentioned this and continue to adhere to this position. Russian-Iranian trade and economic cooperation is mutually beneficial. It is not subject to external sanction pressures. Russia and Iran are committed to long-term interaction across various domains, including energy. We intend to continue developing trade ties with all interested states, focusing primarily on our national interests rather than threats and intimidation from third countries. European leaders are not only unprepared to discuss the causes and possibilities of resolving the Ukrainian crisis, but are consistently inclined to torpedo any Russian and, incidentally, American initiatives to find peaceful solutions to the conflict. We certainly monitor the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean region closely, and of course express concern about the growing tension, escalation, and aggressive rhetoric, including towards our friendly Republic of Cuba. We advocate for resolving any intergovernmental contradictions politically and diplomatically. We are convinced that the language of blackmail and threats is simply not acceptable, especially concerning the island of freedom, its people and government, which have been experiencing for decades the horror of illegitimate, unlawful sanctions, which have indeed gone into history as the blockade. We hope that pragmatism and common sense should eventually prevail. Nicolas Maduro, as head of state, has absolute immunity from the jurisdiction of the United States or any other state, apart from, of course, Venezuela. Therefore, even setting aside the issue of the illegal use of force, which we have commented extensively, the very fact of his abduction and custody is a gross violation of the United States' international legal obligations. Any judicial decisions would also be illegal unless the American court recalls international law and orders the release of, so to speak, the abducted, I can't even say arrested. The argument that Nicolas Maduro ceased his presidential duties and thus supposedly lost immunity cannot be accepted, as his removal from office resulted from the United States of America's illegal force operation.